Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Ask a Political Scientist. My name is Andrea Jones-Rooy, and I am thrilled that you are here. This is show 5 of 6 of our election countdown season. We have one more show next week, but welcome, a warm welcome to our penultimate episode for this season. So as mentioned, my name is Andrea Jones-Rooy. I am a political scientist and a comedian, and the main thing I want you to know about me is that I love political science, and this show is all about celebrating political science and hopefully making those of you out there who do not already love political science soon join me in this strange cult that I am slowly building on YouTube. So a warm welcome to new folks and a welcome back to my fellow political science enthusiasts. As a reminder, I am a proud member of the world's smartest podcast network. We have just launched and we have just 3 founding podcasts: The Political Orphanage with Andrew Heaton, Lost in America with Turner Sparks and Michael Ira Kaplan, and my show. So if you've enjoyed this show, check out these other shows that bring comedy and political analysis and smart people all together, and we have a good time. Today's episode, we are here to talk about changing minds. We are going to talk about how to have effective conversations about politics, and in particular, how to have effective conversations about politics that hopefully reduce prejudice. And we are going to talk about it through a lens of some really great research on fighting transphobia, as well as pushing for and advocating for LGBT rights. But we will also speak more broadly about political conversations and a few other topics relative to the election. We have 2 political science guests tonight. Brace yourselves. That's right. 2 political scientists plus me is like 2.5, and we're thrilled. So brace yourselves for some serious knowledge in this episode. Our first political scientist that we have joining us, we have Melissa Michelson, who is a very accomplished political scientist at Menlo College, where she is also the Dean of Arts and Sciences. She is an expert on Latinx as well as LGBTQ politics, and we are actually going to force her to talk a little bit about her work on Latinx politics, and in particular on mobilizing Latinx voters towards the end of tonight's show. She is also an award-winning mentor and is someone who is out there empowering folks to be allies and to work for change. So we are so honored that she is here. Our other political scientist guest is Brian Harrison, who is at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He is many things: social scientist, writer, media consultant, award-winning teacher, lots of awards in tonight's show, and he's an expert on communication. We'll talk a lot about his tips on difficult political conversations and how we can have those in the coming weeks and months and maybe years. And he works on the role of identity in American public opinion. So we're thrilled that he is here. They have written 2 books. They're most together. They've written some other books separately. Their most recent book is Transforming Prejudice, Identity, Fear, and Transgender Rights. And we are going to be talking about that. It came out just this year. But they have also co-authored Listen, We Need to Talk, How to Change Attitudes About LGBT Rights. And I am going to ask them to talk about that as well, because there's a lot of work to do on both of these fronts. Every week in this show, instead of tickets, we raise money for a good cause. This week, we are raising money very proudly for the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. It is based in New York City, and it provides legal aid and legal services to transgender, intersex, gender nonconforming individuals, particularly folks of color, low-income communities, and immigrants. So all proceeds that come in during tonight's show and anything that came in over the Eventbrite, I will donate tomorrow straight away to the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. So thank you all. If you're enjoying the show and you're able to contribute, you can simply go to the link in the show description, which is also this link right here, paypal.me/AskAPS, and I'll send everything over tomorrow. And I will show you a receipt so you know I'm not just stealing it. Great. All right, so here's how our show is going to go down today. We are going to talk about transforming prejudice, and we are going to talk about how to change attitudes about LGBT rights. Brian has a new book coming out called A Change is Gonna Come, How to Have Effective Political Conversations in a Divided America. Super topical. We're going to get some tips from him about broader political conversations. Melissa is the co-author of lots and lots of other books. One of them is Mobilizing Inclusion, How to Transform the Electorate Through Get Out the Vote campaigns. And we are going to talk about what is going to work between now and Election Day to get out the vote. And in particular, we're going to tap into her expertise on getting out the Latinx vote. And finally, we want to hear from you. This is an interactive show. Ask a Political Scientist means you genuinely can ask a political scientist. So throughout the show, as you have questions, toss them into the YouTube chat. I will look at them mostly near the end, but go ahead and send them throughout, and I'll try to get to all of them. So we do want to hear from you. So keep those questions coming. And now, with that, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guests for tonight's show. We have Melissa Michelson and Brian Harrison. How are you both?
Cold. I'm in Minnesota.
You're cold. Minnesota is snowing.
It's warm over here. I'll trade you some hotness for some snow.
Okay, and so Menlo, you're in the Bay Area, I take it, Melissa?
Yeah, Silicon Valley. So it's in the 80s and 90s still out here. No snow for us.
Very nice. Now, I ask about the fire situation?
We are fairly far away
from fire.
We're far enough away from the fire now that we don't have to worry about the smoke, but there have been multiple times recently where the smoke is so bad you can't go outside. And it's nasty. There were those orange skies. We had that here. So that's super fun. Okay. Post-apocalyptic skies.
Okay, yeah. Cold Minnesota is sounding better and better to me. So.
It does, yeah.
I'm in a foggy, boring temperature New York. That's where I am. So cut it in half. So we have a lot to talk about. I want to talk about your most recent co-authored book first, Transforming Prejudice. Talk to me a little bit about what is the goal of the book? How did you both come to write it? What can readers expect if they pick it up, which they should?
Well, obviously, everyone should pick it up and read it because this is a very important topic. And the reason we wrote this book is because as we were finishing up the previous book, which was done, the work for the previous book together was done in cooperation with a lot of LGBTQ advocacy organizations. And as we were wrapping up the book, they were turning their attention to transgender rights, right? So as the fight for same-sex marriage was wrapping up in 2014, that was the new issue on the horizon. And conservatives were also pushing the bathroom issue. So we are like, okay, yes, this is the next thing in LGBTQ rights. We need to work on pushing people to be less prejudiced and less transphobic. So that's why we started working on it.
We were also responsive to a lot of advocates who said that there was a focus on marriage equality to the detriment of other members of the LGBTQ community. And we took that seriously. And I think that was and continues to be a real problem. So, we wanted to branch out because marriage equality isn't the end all be all. And a lot of people were sort of left out of the progress.
Right. And I'm thinking back, I was in New York City at the time that was announced. And it was, of course, many were very excited. And it was sort of like a now check, we solved it, right? And as you correctly point out, transgender rights, of course, a whole suite of other rights as well, are certainly not wrapped up in that particular piece of legislation, for sure.
Yeah, but a lot of people are like, okay, good, we're done.
Right.
Like, as you just mentioned, and these advocacy groups are like, no, wait.
Right.
There's so much more.
Right. So in the book, you focus on two big, themes that kind of give me a knot in my stomach when I think about it: fear and identity. So what is the role of fear and identity when we think about transgender rights, transphobia, and the kinds of conversations that you're hoping that folks will have, or the sorts of attitudes that they will change?
So I think when I think about how or the state of emotion toward transgender people and rights, I think back to the mid 20th century, when I think back to how particularly gay men, but LG people were treated. And there was this arc. There was for centuries, millennia, gay men were treated as predators, as mentally ill, as something to be afraid of. And frankly, for most of American history, that was the case. And gradually over the course of a few decades, that fear gave way to other emotions, more positive emotions. And that's ultimately what led to fertile grounds for something like marriage equality. But when you look at transgender rights, we're not nearly there. We're still in that fear, that disgust, that anger phase of sort of social change. And so when we looked at what we're going to do to try to change attitudes about transgender rights, there was really no way that we could ignore the emotional baggage that a lot of people carry when it comes to transgender people, a lot of the misinformation that people have about transgender people. So we wanted to write a book that was a silver bullet that changed everyone's mind and made life wonderful for transgender people. But we really had to take a step back and say, you know what? We can't push too hard. We're not there yet. We need to sort of look at the fundamentals and start there.
And the fundamentals, I guess, are this fear piece, or as you described, disgust or anger. I mean, these are very strong negative emotions. And your description of what, gay men faced, several decades ago, to what do you attribute the change away from discuss? Not that it's gone in all parts of this country or the world, but to what do you attribute that changing attitude? And is identity or transforming identity part of that change?
A lot of what happened in terms of changing attitudes toward gay and lesbian people was people coming out, and then folks realizing that they were already friends and family members who they already knew and loved, who were members of the gay community. And that is why leaders like Heartbeat Milk said, you must come out. You must come out to your families and your friends. And they did. And so many people had these interpersonal relationships with people who they already knew, who then said, hey, guess what? I'm gay. And so people changed their minds, right? Because they already knew this person. And then there was also media exposure, more and more positive portrayals of gay people in the media. But it was a very deliberate attempt to push back that really started in the 1990s, that changed minds. That doesn't work for transgender people so much. Number one, because there's fewer of them. And number two, as Brian mentioned, everyone is still a little bit freaked out, right? Somebody being gay doesn't threaten us, and that gets to identity. Somebody being gay doesn't threaten us because now we think, oh, they're just like me. They love, they want families, they want marriage. Transgender people, that threatens your binary gender identity in ways that for many people is way too scary. It's like the opposite of gender reveal parties. Like, there is no such thing. Get over it. And
when is the gender hide party? I want that one. That's like, I'll never tell you. How about that? Yeah.
Right? Wouldn't that be amazing if we lived somewhere where it was a secret and you really had to know someone really well before they tell you their gender?
I guess I'll tell you my gender.
Once we're in a good relationship, then maybe I'll tell you later. That would be hilarious.
Yeah.
This sounds like a science fiction plot. Brian, you need another book plot?
Kinda. I am writing a novel,
really?
But it's about murder and awfulness, because that's where my soul is going these days. But that's
in dark times.
That's a different show.
Right.
What I wanted to mention is there is an underpinning for both books about an in-group and out-group dynamic, and it's a well-known thing in social psychology that we tend to prefer people that we see and feel are like us in some important way, and we tend to distrust and not like people who we perceive as being in the out group. So really a lot of our work is sort of rooted in that kind of fundamental human phenomenon. Now, it's not universal, it's not perfect, but generally speaking, we like people who are like us. We like to be around them. We listen to what they have to say. We trust what they have to say, and obviously vice versa for people who are in out groups. So I know we'll talk about the first book in a little bit, but one of the problems with transgender folks is a lot of people don't see that shared kinship or that shared identity in some way. That being transgender is just so fundamentally different that it doesn't matter if we live in the same community, or we have the same religion, or we have another identity in common in some way. It's such a fundamentally different and sort of jarring identity, like Melissa said, because it does make people think that sex and gender are different concepts. It does make people think that gender is not binary. It's something that upsets their own identity in a way that limits a lot of discussion and free thinking. And that's really where our book was coming from. How can we come up with some strategies and tactics to get people out of this discomfort, and maybe not persuade them entirely, hopefully, but maybe not persuade them entirely, but at least get them into a mindset where they're able to listen to new information, to consider something sort of outside of their opinion silo, and hopefully move their needle a little bit on transgender rights. So that's really the goal of the book in the first place.
Well, and as you're both describing this, I'm thinking, we can learn from the analogy from what gay men went through, gay people went through, et cetera. But I'm also thinking it sounds really painful to say, well, the way to make people accept you is to all come out in force, and then really have probably really difficult interactions, and it probably really made life very scary and very, I don't have any experience coming out, but it sounds like a very stressful thing to endure. And if, doing that to force people you love to like be okay with it sounds like a really hard way to move the needle forward. So maybe if there's a way to make it less painful, rather than just say, yeah, get used to it, and it's just going to be a long slog until we do. So I like this idea of
our books are really more for allies too.
Right.
Like that is very hard and can be very unpleasant the way coming out goes. We're trying to put tools in the hands of people who want to be allies, right?
Excellent.
So that if you don't identify as LGBT, but you can be an ally and you can have these conversations. That's the tool we're trying to put into people's hands with these books. This is not telling members of the LGBTQ community what to do. They already know how to come out and how to do that, but let's help, right? That is especially important for transgender people because it is really unsafe often for them to come out. So we all have to help. All the allies have to help.
Right.
And it's also a personal pet peeve when people are like, oh, attitudes toward gay rights moved quickly. Well, no, millennia we're talking about here. They moved quickly in a short period of time. That's absolutely true. And that really is part of our
very specific dimensions, but
on very specific things. But when people say, oh, look how quickly things moved, it's like there are generations of people for whom it did not move at all, if not backward. So we are mindful of history. We're not saying, look how great things are, people should come out. That's really not at all the impression that we would want to give. But one documented, scientifically proven method of changing minds on LGBTQ rights is knowing someone who is LGBT, or in our work specifically LG. T might be a little bit different story.
Right. So in your book, in Transforming Prejudice, one of the core ideas is this idea of identity reassurance theory. And to me, that seems like the heart of the book and sort of where a lot of the effort goes in, and a lot of your empirical work, experimental work supports this. What is going on with identity reassurance theory?
So what we found with an initial experiment, which tested the theory from our first book, was about shared identity, like I was talking about. You can remind someone that they have something in common with a previously perceived outgroup, and that shared identity should make them more likely to not be as afraid, to be more open to information, and to be more likely to be persuaded. So we wondered if that would also work for transgender people. And as I mentioned, it didn't. So we really went back to the drawing board and said, okay, where are people at the beginning of conversations? We have to consider people where they are, not where we'd like them to be. And what we concluded was people are still fundamentally uncomfortable with the idea of transgender identity. And if you're going to try to get people past that discomfort, one technique that we borrowed from social psychology was you have to make people more confident in their own identities before they're going to be able to move on and really think through the nuances of this outgroup that might be misunderstood. And so identity reassurance theory says, in order to get people into a mindset where they're able to be open to hearing about transgender people, transgender identity, transgender rights, you have to reassure them that their own identities that may be highly important to their self-concept aren't being threatened. They're not something that we're coming for. We're not saying you yourself are invalid in this way. We're saying, you're cool, you're good where you are. Now let's move forward and talk about some things that you may be uncomfortable with. And psychology tells us it works in a lot of ways that we can run through. If you can reassure people that what we're not saying is you're fundamentally wrong with the way that you look at the world. We're not shaming folks to say you may be uncomfortable with transgender people. What a terrible person you are. That comes again to a threatening point of view, a defensive point of view. But rather, if you can listen to people and say, okay, I see where you are, I hear where you are, but let's not let where you are be an obstacle to where we want to go. And that's really the core sort of tenet of the identity reassurance theory.
And so how do you have those conversations? Is it to say, I'm thinking of, US culture, we talk about like ideas of, and this isn't the same thing as gender, but the idea of masculinity versus femininity. We talk about toxic masculinity, and Americans have complicated ideas even within the gender binary about what genders ought to be and do and all these things. Is it wrapped up in that and folks not feeling comfortable, like you're saying that I'm cisgender or you're saying that I'm, identify as a man and that makes them uneasy? Or is it that there's some threat to their own identity and they must also be transgender or something like that? Like, what's the fear?
We're not necessarily saying you have to take on toxic masculinity head on. But
Okay.
for example,
step 1, take on toxic masculinity. Step 2,
right?
transphobia.
So
Yeah.
world peace.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
But
your other new book. Got it. Yeah.
Check. We're just checking. We're just fixing all the things.
Yeah.
Take them on a journey story. Just take them on a journey. So for a lot of people, it can be threatening to their identity of like, this is what I believe and this is who I am. And to change your mind is problematic because now you're admitting you were wrong. Maybe it looks like you don't have consistent values. Like people are resistant to changing their minds, but you can give them permission to change their mind by sharing a journey story. So for example, in one of our experiments, we shared the journey story of a woman who had been very religious, had not believed that transgender people were quote unquote real, that it was a mental illness. And then it turned out that her child was transgender. And once the mom realized that her child was a trans girl, she reassessed her opposition to transgender people and her position about whether transgender people are born that way, and changed her mind. And so if you share that story with people and you say, look, this person changed their mind, then they are less transphobic, and like they can see that they're being given permission to change their mind. And you can see the same thing in some of the PSAs from LGBT advocacy organizations. There's a really great one from the Movement Advancement Project where it shows this transgender man with his coworkers, and they're like, we were kind of uncomfortable when Zeke told us he was transgender, and he says, and that's okay. But the more then we got used to it, and now they're all going to lunch together and they're laughing. Right? It's giving you permission, like you can reconsider. It's okay to change your mind. So that's just one example, right? But it's reassuring people like, you're going to be okay. Come on this journey with me. Let's change your mind. Some people thought this and then changed their mind, and it's okay. It's okay. And you're okay. And I'm okay. We're all okay.
The more you just keep saying we're okay, I'm like, oh, this is actually really helping me just generally in life. Just for the record. I know it's not the goal.
Gesticulating wildly at the dumpster fire of America. Yeah. And the world. Yeah. It's going to be okay.
We also want people who aren't academics to be able to take something away from our work. So yes, we have all the t-tests and all this statistical stuff and things we get that all the time. But there are a lot of numbers, there are a lot of charts and whatever. However, we do want there to be practical things that people can actually do and take away from the work. So in this book, for example, something that someone can do in practice is be more comfortable with showing vulnerability in political conversations. It's something that I write about in my solo author book a lot too, but it's I think a lot of people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. So when a transgender person comes around, they're a well-meaning person. They don't have a specific objection or something that makes them uncomfortable, but they're terrified at saying the wrong thing, calling them the wrong name, using the wrong pronoun. And I think one technique that I use as a cisgender person is I'll say, oh my gosh, I totally understand that fear, right? It can be really scary when you want to engage with someone and you really don't want to offend them and say the wrong thing. And I think by acknowledging that I feel that too, people are like, oh, okay, I'm not a bad person. I don't want bad things for others, but it's validating to hear that, okay, even someone who is in favor of transgender rights has those same feelings that I do too. And so if you can introduce some vulnerability into your conversations and admit, like Melissa said in the journey story, that, I used to think X and now I think Y, or, you know what, a lot of people feel uncomfortable about this. And to be honest with you, I did too for a long time until I changed. And that's a practical thing that you can do in a political conversation about anything, but it works particularly well for transgender rights as well.
Well, and I was just going to ask if it applies more broadly, but it sounds like it's sort of like two things in there, right? Where one is to say it's okay to change your mind. I've changed my mind. Folks change their mind, and that's a welcome thing, because I take your point that it's a painful thing and most of us don't like to do it or admit that we were wrong, and especially something so central to our identity as our gender or something like that, right? And then the second piece is to show this vulnerability and to say, as we talk about this, I'm going to stumble, you're going to stumble, we're going to make mistakes, and so it's kind of like two layers of that's okay, basically.
Yeah. Acknowledging the discomfort, right? That's part of it.
And I
but
do want to
having the conversation, like that's another one of our takeaways in the book. Like, don't be so uncomfortable that you don't do it, because you're not going to change anyone's mind if you don't talk to them.
Right.
Or if you pretend you didn't hear it when they say something transphobic. Like, you have to say, like, I think I just heard you say this. Can we talk about that? You have that uncomfortable situation. So if you want to be an ally, you just have to do it to like channel your inner
discomfort. No, I'm just saying, we don't need to hear the stuff I'm reading on the internet, but generally, if you look up allyship, it's a lot of reminders that being an ally is hard and being an ally is scary, and it's not enough to put a rainbow in your profile picture and call it good. And the same goes for if you want to be, work towards anti-racism or be an ally for any, marginalized group. It's about being vulnerable, being wrong, and being uncomfortable. So my sense anyway, my question then is so suppose someone is at home now watching this and saying, I want to be an ally. I'm up for the challenge of a difficult conversation. How do I do that? Do I wait till someone says something transphobic and pounce? Do I start the conversation the next time I FaceTime with my family? I mean, how does one go about actively being this ally and taking this on in a thoughtful way?
That's really the core of my solo authored book that I know we're going to talk about a little bit.
Okay.
But
we can get to it. Let's go. Yeah.
Do it.
No, that's cool. We'll stay on schedule. But in LA, I think what Melissa said was exactly right. It's okay to not know exactly what to say or when to say it, but realizing that imperfection is a big part of true political conversation. And I think, and this is one of the impetuses for my book, people are often afraid to do something they're not already good at. And it's easier to disengage and to sort of be above it all. It's far easier psychologically and just interpersonally. But if you really want to be an ally, you have to be uncomfortable. There's just really no two ways about it. And the more you normalize that discomfort, the more that you practice that discomfort, to be honest, the better you are at overcoming the discomfort and not letting it be an obstacle to trying something. So I think, I encounter a lot of people, again, on transgender rights who say, I'm really afraid to talk to a transgender person because what if I call them the wrong name or I say something offensive and that's a really common example that I've heard. And I try to make it funny where I'm like, well, what did you plan to call them? Right? Like, if you look at the range of things, a well-meaning person who wants to engage in a conversation with a transgender person probably isn't going to accidentally say something horrific, right? So do your best. And most of the transgender people I know who see someone willingly engaging in a genuine conversation are not going to be terribly offended if someone happens to use the wrong pronoun or says something that isn't perfect in the conversation. I think that they would appreciate the attempt. So I think that's the message. If there's someone or something that you want to get across, don't let the fear of perfection get in your way of trying in the first place.
I would also just imagine go ahead.
Sorry. I think you can bring it up fairly easily because unfortunately there's like always something in the news. Like in any 24-hour news cycle, there's, the Pope said this and Trump did that and, this happened over here. And so, just like we're always sharing information with people about the news and social media and, in the small talk at the beginning of a Zoom conversation,
right?
You have opportunities. So,
and I think we've all become more and more comfortable. It's not the right word. We've been confronted by the concept of privilege, particularly over the last 6 months.
Right.
And of course, it relates to race and ethnicity, but it also relates to things like transgender rights, where as a cisgender person, I do have the privilege to ignore a lot of what happens. And I choose not to, because I don't think it's the right thing to do. So if you want to be an anti-racist, good, you should do that. There are other identities that need support as well. So try to look outside yourself and engage in conversations that help people, even if it doesn't necessarily help you.
Does your work, as you does it touch on intersectionality in any way? So transgender rights are in the news quite a bit among the Black community. Transgender women is the latest story that I heard, but transgender, people of color, etc. Is there work in your book that sort of aligns multiple identities within the transgender community?
So we did some variation in terms of transgender women, transgender men,
Hmm.
but we really didn't get into the racial intersections. At the same time, we recognize and we talk in the book about how the violence and the homicide rate against transgender women of color is, horrifying. And clearly there's a huge issue there. But, among the many experiments in our book, we do not vary the race of the transgender person that is the object of the experimental example that we're using. Hopefully, somebody else will go and do that, right? We've put it out there. Here's our theory. Please go try it with something else. But
good old fashioned science. Take it and apply it to other areas that need attention. Great.
Yeah.
So I want to talk briefly about your earlier book. We're sort of going backwards in time. So listen, we need to talk LGBT rights. Have conversations about LGBT rights more broadly. In this book, you talk about something called dissonant identity priming. Dissonant identity priming. What does this mean, and how is this different from identity reassurance theory?
This is the Pope. This is the Pope saying gay people deserve love and gay people deserve to be part of families. This is when you're like, wait, who said what? That's the dissonant part. And so if you're Catholic and the Pope says something like that, you're like, wait, what? Or if a football player says something supportive and you're a football fan and like you love this team, and now all of a sudden the guys who you love smashing into each other on Monday nights are suddenly saying supportive things about gay rights, you're like, okay, wait, cognitive speed bump.
Right.
Maybe I support gay marriage. So it's some of you identify with. It's Barack Obama changing Black American minds. It's the Pope changing Catholics' minds. That's what the first book is about.
So is the idea there, and we actually talked about this in the context of race with Vince Hutchings a little bit last week, where, a message from an elite, either political figure or someone you look up to, that is supportive of, rights for Black folks or rights for transgender folks or whatever, that you don't expect it to come from that person, then it really lands. So like, for example, if we could get Trump to all of a sudden say, yes, we care about climate change, like we would have a huge wave of people who care about climate change, right? Is that?
Maybe.
Okay. Not that easy.
I don't know if we believe anything Trump says at this point, but the point is that the dissonance makes it more powerful. That you weren't expecting that person to have that attitude, and it gets your attention more than somebody like of course he says that, right?
Right.
Of course, I don't know, of course the Pope wants you to go to mass. Of course football players encourage team sports. Like, you'd be like, yeah, of course. But when they say something you weren't expecting, it gets your attention.
So we need, for LGBT rights broadly, for transgender rights in particular, folks who we would not traditionally expect to be supportive of transgender folks or LGBT communities to come out and support.
Yeah,
is that fair?
It's really helpful. And that's why things like Athlete Ally are really powerful, right? Where it's like, here's people you wouldn't expect that from.
Okay. And how do you study these things? You've mentioned these experiments. You talked about having, particular people in the experiment who you manipulate the treatment. What is it that you're doing to understand what works when we have these kinds of conversations?
So generally, one strategy that we used was using the identical quotation of an excerpt of something and attributing it either to an anonymous source or someone who isn't an in-group Q, and attributing it to an in-group Q. So for example, we had 500 people, 250 of whom identified as people of faith, 250 of whom identified not as people of faith. Everyone read the same paragraph saying, marriage is important. It should be included in the church. It should be something that the church recognizes and embraces. And in one instance, it was attributed to an anonymous op-ed writer. In the other instance, it was attributed to the person who actually said it, who was a pastor in a church in Maryland. And what we hypothesized was that attribution will matter quite a bit to people of faith. It won't matter at all to people who aren't people of faith. It doesn't activate this in-group Q. So what we found is it didn't really matter which of these paragraphs and attributions you read if you weren't a people of faith. There was no in-group Q that pushed you above and beyond where you would have been anyway. But for people of faith who were randomized into a group where they thought this quotation came from a religious figure, their support of marriage equality jumped up at least 10 percentage points from the control group.
Just because it came from that person of faith.
Just changing about 5 words between the treatment and control, just from the attribution.
Now, we have a lot of listeners from Maryland. Is it possible that it was just a Maryland thing?
I don't
think
that's
sure.
It was a national survey.
Right. Fine. All right.
We didn't have fixed effects by state, but I would say I doubt it. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Maryland. I have a lot of Maryland pride these days, but not there, I guess. Very good.
Plus, it worked over and over again, right? With lots of different things. It worked in Wisconsin with Green Bay Packers fans. It worked it worked in all these different situations. And so it wasn't just this special Maryland thing. Sorry, Maryland people.
Sorry, Maryland. No.
You're not special. I mean, you are, but
not really. I'll get the hate mail from Maryland now. So is a takeaway from that as an ally? So I am not, this will come as a shock to you, a religious leader, nor am I a celebrated Green Bay Packer player. This, again, shocking.
Right.
But what could I, as a regular person who wants to be an ally, do with this information? Does this mean I could write to, if I am a community of faith, I could write to my leaders and say it would be meaningful if you said something? Or is it the case that I could just go out to my community that maybe doesn't share these views, but I'm not a leader, but I could still be espousing.
But you still share the identity. You still share the identity. And so if you're a trusted member of that community, they might still be more likely to listen to what you have to say, right? That's what relational organizing is all about. But you can also point them towards other people, right? So I might not be a Packer Hall of Famer, but if I'm trying to convince somebody and I can find, hey, here's a quote from a Hall of Famer, you might be interested to read this, right? Or, hey, did you see what Obama just said? If I'm trying to convince somebody who's Black, that, right, you can be the catalyst that puts the information in front of them.
Right.
And I can't let this go, Melissa, I'm sorry. The fact that she called him a football dude who smashes into other guys,
listen,
does underscore the fact that Melissa herself would not be a great cue for football fans. Just throwing that
I
out
love
there.
the sports ball. I don't know what you're talking about.
Very good. All right. So we want to reach out to new communities, but also stay in our lane is what I'm hearing.
It's more powerful. It is. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm thinking now about like communities in New York City, and I am overly simplifying, but what if most of the people I know also want to fight for transgender rights, fight for LGBT rights? Should I go out and like secretly make friends with like a sport, like join a soccer team or something to infiltrate? I mean, what about those of us who live in something of bubbles? Not that everyone is aligned, but I think a lot of us probably do, right?
You're making it sound much more devious and sexy than it actually is.
I think we should try it. I think you should go undercover.
Okay.
You could pass for a transphobic, hateful Karen. We'll send you out. I'm
going to use that as the clip. That's the trailer. For this one.
I think
we do not recommend subterfuge in that way. I think there's always somebody though. There's, your stereotypical racist uncle. There's your problematic neighbor.
Yep.
I'm going to just guess that everybody knows somebody who could use a little conversation.
That's right.
And the other thing is it's a good idea to assess where your community is. If you live in rural Oklahoma, your task may be really different than someone who lives in New York City. Right. So it's looking at your social circles, figuring out where they are, figuring out where you might want them to go. And it would look really different depending on your environment.
Right. And I take the point, this was not at all to say that, since New Yorkers are as woke as can be, then there's no work. My work here is done. That's obviously not a fair statement either.
Would that it were true.
Yes, indeed. Yes. I'm like, well, we finished. So I want to take a moment as advertised, and you build up some nice suspense, Brian, to turn to your book, A Change is Going to Come, where you talk about practical tips for having effective political conversations more broadly in a divided America. First question for you, a change is going to come. Is it a good change?
So I think the alternative title of We're All Screwed and We Should Give Up was not well received by the focus groups.
Yep.
So we went with A Change is Going to Come. And yes, I think a change could come if we take a step back and think about the way that we talk with other people about politics. And that's really what the book focuses on. There's this perception that everyone in the abstract supports getting along and good government and let's all hold hands and get along in the abstract. But when it comes to individual level decisions, people generally don't change their behavior. And so we still post hateful things on social media. We still look for like the kill and the ideal thing to say on Twitter to make someone feel less than and feel smaller than, even if we feel like we're the kind of person who wants a robust deliberative democracy. So that was an interesting juxtaposition for me. Even well-meaning people who want good things don't generally change the behavior. So how can we get better at it? And it gets to a lot of the things that we've been talking about discomfort. And my kid, I have 8-year-old twins, and they were the basis for some of this because I have a boy and a girl, and my daughter loves to paint, but could care less about sports. And my son loves sports, but could care less about picking up a crayon. And when I told them, let's try to do something else. Let's try to do something that isn't the thing that you like to do. They said, well, I don't want to do that. I'm not good at it. And it got me thinking, we don't like to do things we're not good at. And being uncomfortable and embracing discomfort in conversations with someone with whom you may not agree is scary and hard, and we don't want to do it. And the only way that we can get past it is to get better at being uncomfortable and getting better at having conversations that lead people down a road rather than closing off the road in the first place. So that's really the impetus for the book, is to say, listen, nothing in here is groundbreaking, is not something that you've heard before. I totally admit that. However, y'all don't do any of these things, right? So
yeah, I know I need to be uncomfortable, but I am not. And
well, and don't make people defensive. Don't call people who disagree with you idiots. Don't do all of those things that we all do. So it really is a call for people to step back, take a look at some of the social science to what persuasion actually is, and ways that you can lead people down a path into change rather than closing it off in the first place. And I think I make the point time and time again, persuasion is a process. And it feels like we should be able to find the perfect thing to say, the perfect message, the perfect medium. And, I think something and you disagree, but if I can find just the right mix of things, I can change your mind. And that's not how it works. And so it's a call to really look at the way that you speak to others about politics, to rely on psychology, on just sort of practical things that you can do in everyday conversations. And it really encourages people to be more comfortable with discomfort, which, is kind of a big ask, but it's an important one.
And is the takeaway, one of the takeaways, kind of akin to what we were talking about in the context of transgender conversations about transgender rights and acceptance, is just to kind of find a chance to open it up and just approach someone who's different, or as you said, use those idle Zoom minutes for good? I mean, is it something that we can do here and there throughout our day, or is it like once a year when, we all see our racist uncles? One of my uncles watches this show. I'm not talking about you, okay? But we actually sit him down and have like a heart-to-heart and work it out, right?
I think yes to all of those things.
Yeah.
I think I was also reflecting. I talk about politics all the time. I'm a political scientist. That's what I do. And people don't shy away from talking about politics with me. And it made me think about why that was. And it made me reflect on the way that I talk about politics with other people. And what I do is I generally ask a lot of questions. I listen to what people have to say. I don't tell them they're wrong. I just listen to what they say and then sort of try to move them in a direction. So really, the call is to be more strategic with your communication, and to think through where someone likely is at the beginning of a conversation, and where you realistically might move them at the end of the conversation, because we know where someone begins and where someone ends a conversation is so strongly correlated. And so if you can think through, how to get people to move, even if it's inch by inch, I don't think anyone is unpersuadable. I really don't. I just think that we don't do a very good job of thinking through the way that we engage with other people that we disagree with.
I think that's a great reminder. And I think a lot, I will be very candid that I don't have enough of these difficult conversations. And one of the many things that I think about is like, well, I'm not going to change their mind through this conversation, so why bother, right? It's like, I'm not going to get them to agree with my point of view. But I think that's a really valuable point, that, but it could open up some space for some movement later, or it could be the smallest teeny tiny bit of movement, which eventually could be quite powerful. And that's how you get it moving.
And when people sort of form the calculus about whether they have an opinion or on whether they have an attitude and on what they're basing, what information they're using to form that opinion, you never know when someone is going to reach for the kernel that you gave them. So, when you ask someone, what do you think about abortion? They may have 10 considerations, right? And let's say they take a random sample of those considerations. Well, if you never introduce your consideration to them, they're certainly not going to sample it. So, the likelihood might be low that you're going to make a difference when they're expressing an attitude or expressing an opinion. But it's better to introduce something to them than not. And the way you introduce something to someone is by relational politics, is by not getting them on the defensive. It's to show them that you're genuinely engaged, and it's something that we don't do well. And there's a ton of practical examples of how you can do it better if you really have the interest.
Right. So folks should buy your book. And I'm just thinking about the debate and how we're not going to see this being practiced. That's my prediction. That's my prediction for politics for tonight. And what you're describing, asking questions, trying to understand where someone's coming from, saying it's okay to change your mind. I mean, we're not going to see it.
No, it'd be lovely if we did, but we won't. And, it's good politics to not do those things. So, a lot before people have read my book, they criticize it by saying, well, how dare you tell everyone to be civil and just be nice? And it's like, no, that's not at all what the book is about. There are certainly times in our life to kick and scream and shout and to fight with every, fiber of our being for something that's important. There really are those life and death things going on in American politics right now. But I implore people to think those situations are fewer in number. And there's all sorts of opportunities to talk to people in respectful ways that don't close off those avenues. So take advantage of those. And you don't necessarily have to make it a big thing. You don't have to make a presentation. You don't have to sit someone down and give them a talking to. It's really looking at the ways that you engage with other people in interpersonal communication, from the grocery line to the soccer game to the pickup line at school. Right. It's those everyday conversations that really matter.
I'm just thinking about all those conversations where I'm just staring at my phone. And so maybe that's a takeaway for me, is maybe speak to someone at all, full stop. How about that?
You are a New Yorker, aren't you?
Yeah. Talk to people. You lost me there. Sorry about that. Melissa, I want to dive into your research, but I want to actually take a moment before we change topics, just to grab one question from the audience. A great question coming in from Sephirum. Sorry, I'm probably saying that wrong. My question is, do you think positive pop culture representation is helpful, harmful, or neutral? Like, does it only really reach the people who agree with it to begin with?
No, I think it's wildly a good thing. I think there are any number of examples, particularly with transgender people. For a long time, the only time that you saw a transgender person in a TV show or a movie was if they were a sex worker, if they were sort of a character to deride or to make fun of, or someone who was a killer or a drug user. Those are really the only times that you ever saw a transgender person in media. And over the last decade, that has dramatically changed. Yep. And it really, the portrayals, are not always positive. That's not the point, but they're more realistic and they more accurately paint the picture of what it means to be transgender. And I think those make their way into all sorts of things, not just for people who already agree.
Right. And you can find, aspects of a character that you identify with, even if you don't identify with being transgender or don't understand it still, or so forth. I take your point. Just a couple other shout outs. And then Melissa, here comes your research. Folks in the audience are excited for the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Hooray. Wonderful. Awesome. A few people are sharing that, they've worried about using the wrong pronoun, maybe find themselves apologizing too much. So that's resonating as well. I have at least 2 uncles watching the show. My entire family watches the show. It's a complicated way of getting political scientists to hang out with my family. Awesome. And on that theme, so we have a comment here from my Aunt Beth, who's an ambassador. And she says that diplomacy is all about having difficult conversations. Asking questions, as Brian suggested, is a very good way to move a conversation along towards changing behavior. So excellent. So it works for transgender rights, it works for political persuasion broadly, and it works for international diplomacy. So that's quickly write a sequel jointly.
All right, let's go, Ambassador Beth.
Excellent, great. So Melissa, you have a whole other world of research that we probably should talk about on a whole separate show, but I don't want to leave without talking about it. Voter mobilization, which is on all of our minds, and in particular among Latinx voters. So talk to us about what we can all do in the next 2 weeks, or I don't even know how many days it is, very few, between now and Election Day, to increase voter mobilization. Or is it not that fast and we should have been doing it for 10 years?
Yes, both. But
okay. Okay.
one of the biggest takeaways from my research is that sometimes people don't vote, particularly in historically marginalized communities, including Latinx people, because nobody's asking them to. The rates of outreach to especially low propensity voters who are people of color tends to be really low. And so you can do that, right? You can go find a group to volunteer with. Don't just like start knocking on doors randomly or randomly dialing people's numbers, but there are groups that are doing this work, obviously very much so in swing states, but really in every state. And you can find an organization that is working on getting out the Black vote, getting out the Latinx vote, getting out the Native American vote, and they will help you make contact with those people and they'll train you. And there is definitely time to do this, and it will make a difference because you need that human contact. It's so much, what the research shows is that it's that interpersonal contact that really makes the difference. It's a live phone call. It's someone showing up at the soccer game and walking around talking to people. It's showing up at the farmer's market. It's going to places of worship. It's personal outreach. And obviously we have to do that in a COVID safe way, and we all have to be careful about that. But phone banking and text banking are actually quite powerful ways to increase the vote. And there's tons of groups doing this. It's mostly local community organizations doing it in a nonpartisan way and just saying, hey, come help us get out the vote. If you're bilingual, great. If you're not, don't worry. We'll assign you to people who are, are good with English, and you can help. And it actually really works. And you don't have to be a member of that community, although it's helpful.
My next question.
Yeah, it is more powerful if you're a member of that community. But if you're just working with a trusted group, then it doesn't matter, right? So if you want to get out the Latinx vote in Arizona, and so you find a group that is working in Arizona that's a local Latinx serving community organization, you can go volunteer with them. You don't even have to be from Arizona. You don't have to be Latinx. They will train you. And when you call, you're saying, hey, I'm calling from this group. And the person from the other line will, okay, well, I trust that group. So I'm willing to have a conversation with you.
And is it more powerful to go for local organizations as opposed to, some of the bigger national groups that, for example, text me all the time and ask me if I'm going to vote? And I'm like, text someone else. I'm going to vote, right?
I think local organizations are more trusted. So a lot of the bigger organizations, they have this reputation of like parachuting in for an election season, trying to get everybody to vote for them. And then they're like, okay, bye, see you in 4 years. And so it's less effective versus if you're working with a local community organization, and this is some of what Lisa Garcia Bedoya and I found in our Mobilizing Inclusion book is if it's a local trusted community organization where they're like, oh, that group, I know you, you've been here, you've been fighting for us, I trust you. And now you're here to tell me to vote. Again, they're more willing to listen, right? Actually, the work with Brian really overlaps with the mobilizing work a lot because what we're trying to do is persuade people to vote. And a message coming from a trusted group, from a group with whom you share an identity is powerful. So I would go for local groups that have a long-standing relationship with the people in that community as opposed to larger groups that maybe don't have that same connection for people.
Okay. And what about the message itself? Is there something, again, getting back to this persuasion, is there something in particular, hey, a reminder to vote versus here's why voting is important or we want to hear from you, this is why I'm not leading these campaigns. Those are not good slogans, right? But what are some of the messages themselves?
Well, the thing is, though, it depends.
Okay.
Right. So this, for example, is what some of the work that I did with Ali Valenzuela finds is that it depends who you're talking to. So if you're talking to some Latino who is less acculturated, who maybe is less proficient in English, is closer to the immigration experience, they might have a stronger Latinx identity. So they're going to be receptive to one kind of message versus if you're talking to somebody else who's like fifth generation, they were here before the border crossed them. They identify more as American. You need to say something different to them, right? So that's micro-targeting, right? That's where that's where the organizations are going to know, right? But they're going to guide you to the best message for that person you're reaching out to because they know, like, for these people, we're going to say this. For these people, we're going to say this because you can identify the best message to reach out to people with based on the information that you can get in these data files about people. So there's no one magical, this is it. This is the magical sentence that gets Latinx people out to vote. There are lots of them.
Yeah, okay.
You know, it's complicated. Right? My favorite phrase, it's complicated.
Right. Well, and the same with all these other conversations is there's no perfect way to have this conversation. What works in one conversation isn't going to work in another, regardless of who we're talking to.
Exactly.
Okay. A question, actually, this is directed, it came in during our segment with Brian, but I'm actually going to direct it to both of you, have you looked at the work of commercial marketers and consumer behavior? Because you're basically selling things, selling ideas to people, right? So political conversations, I would say get out the vote conversations as well. Again, this came in before we started talking, Melissa, but what do you, is marketing valuable here?
Absolutely. And some of my work is co-authored with marketing faculty, right? Because it's really the same thing. We're selling soap, or we're selling voting, or we're selling what, you know, so it is very much consumer behavior marketing research theory that can inform political conversations. I know we all live in our little like disciplinary silos. I'm a political scientist, you're marketing, but it turns out that people in other disciplines sometimes have useful things they've figured out that are useful for politics.
Yes, it turns out. Yes.
And I went to graduate school for a master's in public relations and advertising first. And that was my first master's degree. And I've always had an interest in politics, but it was that angle that made me think, all right, there are quite a few psychological commonalities between this kind of marketing strategy and political strategy. So I think that's where I started my academic career. And I think there's lots of overlap.
Now I'm thinking of my very rudimentary marketing understanding where it's like, what if we spritz the air with citrus? Will people vote then? Like, can I arrange my storefront for transgender rights in some way?
If you show people a lot of pictures of really cute puppies, they're less transphobic. So we did do that experiment. Yeah. We should have spritzed the air with the smell of warm chocolate chip cookies, but we did puppies over the internet instead. And same thing.
All right. My parents just got a puppy, so they're allies.
There you go. Everyone's getting puppies because of the pandemic, and so maybe we're all gonna just be in such good moods because of all the puppies that will become less transphobic.
I did not know there was scientific evidence behind puppies.
Scientific evidence, the power of puppies.
Yes. So we have come to 2 minutes left, and I want to hit my usual lightning round, but I also have a third bonus lightning round just for you two. So first. What's going to happen on election day? Who's going to win, and when will we know? These are my questions. You can go in either order. And then I have a bonus third question, but we'll get to that.
Brian.
Biden will win, but we won't know for about 10 days is my prediction.
Okay.
I think Biden landslide, and we know it when the polls close.
Wow. And you said Brian was the optimist. What? This is a nonpartisan show. I didn't say anything.
He's the pessimist. I'm the Okay, look.
Okay.
No, hold on.
You're the optimist. The other way around.
I gotta get a story in. In 2016, I was at a political event. Melissa was on camera for the election, and I kept texting her things are looking this way. This is how it looks like things are going to turn out. And she kept saying, no, that's not true. That's never going to happen. And I kept texting and saying, no, really, I'm looking at the returns. I really think this is going to happen. And she totally dismissed me. So that is a win for some healthy skepticism.
That was 4 years ago, election night, November 2016, by the way, because as I was driving to the TV station for election night, Brian's like, oh, have you seen Virginia?
Oh, okay.
This time, landslide Democrats. That's my prediction.
Okay, I take that prediction. So my final lightning round question for you both is, what could all of us who are here watching the show, learning from you right now, do tomorrow to be a better ally for transgender rights?
Go ahead, Melissa.
Work it into a conversation. You've probably got 12 Zoom calls, or maybe you're just going to go for a walk to the local coffee shop, go have a conversation with somebody, bring it up. There's plenty of excuses to do so on your news feed. Just go for it.
Okay.
I'll take it a little broader because I think my book gets to this quite a bit too. Take a breath when it comes to talking about politics and try really hard to do a little bit better. So maybe don't post that unflattering picture of a politician. Maybe don't say that terrible thing on Twitter. Just try it and just see how it goes without doing some of those awful things.
Very good. Beautiful advice. Thank you both so much. That has been our show. Melissa Michelson, Brian Harrison, I'm so thrilled that you joined. Their new book is Transforming Prejudice. Please check it out. Brian is also the author of A Change is Going to Come. And Melissa, what's coming out from you? What can we be on the lookout for?
So many things, but actually
many
Brian
things.
and I just wrapped up another book called LGBTQ Life in America. So look for that next year.
LGBTQ Life in America. Fabulous. And as a reminder, we are supporting the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Any money that you send to paypal.me/AskAPS goes straight there. No amount is too small or too big. All right. And we'll see you all next week. We're going to talk with Chinbo Chong about voter mobilization, and in particular about Asian Americans and how they feel about Kamala Harris and overall how to get out the vote, continuing where we left off with Melissa tonight. All right. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everyone who watched. See you next time.
Thank you. That was super fun.